I have 2 daughters already. 2. Ngozi spoke gently. They are beautiful children. Emeka shook his head. That is not the point. Ngozi waited for him to continue. A man needs a son, someone to carry his name and continue his family line. Ngozi folded her hands quietly. Children do not choose their gender. Emeka leaned forward. I know that. He paused before speaking again. But we can still The city of Onitsha was always alive. From early morning until late evening, the streets were filled with movement. Traders shouted to attract customers. Buses honked loudly as they pushed through traffic. People hurried from one place to another, each person chasing a different dream. Among the many homes in that busy city lived a young couple named Emeka and Ngozi. Their house stood in a quiet street, not far from the main market. It was not a very big house, but it was neat and comfortable. The compound had a small mango tree near the gate, and in the evening, cool wind often passed through the yard. Inside that house lived love. Emeka and Ngozi had been married for only a few months, yet their home was already filled with laughter. Every evening after work, Emeka would return home tired but happy. The moment he pushed the gate open, Ngozi would hear the sound and rush out to welcome him. Welcome back, she would say warmly, collecting the small bag he carried. Emeka would smile and reply, Thank you, my dear wife. How was your day? Very good, she would answer. I have been waiting for you. They would walk inside together, talking about their day. Ngozi loved taking care of our home. She cleaned the house carefully, arranged the chairs neatly, and made sure the kitchen smelled nice. She enjoyed cooking for her husband and always tried new recipes. Emeka often praised her. My wife, he would say while eating, you cook better than all the restaurants in this city. Ngozi would laugh shyly. Stop teasing me, she would reply. I am not teasing, Emeka would insist. I am telling the truth. Their marriage was peaceful. They respected each other and supported one another. Emeka worked as a trader in the large Onitsha market. Every morning before sunrise, he would wake up, bathe quickly, and prepare to leave. Ngozi would already be awake in the kitchen. Eat something before you go, she would say, placing a plate of food on the table. Emeka would sit down and eat quickly. You take care of the house, he would say before leaving. I will see you later. I will be waiting, Ngozi would reply with a soft smile. Life was simple, but it was good. In the evenings, when work was finished and the sun had begun to disappear behind the buildings, the couple often sat outside under the mango tree. Sometimes they talked about their childhood, other times they spoke about their dreams. One evening, as cool wind passed through the compound, Emeka leaned back on his chair and looked at the sky. My dear, he said slowly. Ngozi turned to him. Yes? I have been thinking about our future. Ngozi smiled. I think about it too. Emeka rubbed his hands together with excitement. One day we will build a bigger house, a house with many rooms. Ngozi nodded happily. Yes, a house filled with laughter. And children running everywhere, Emeka added quickly. Ngozi laughed softly. You really want children? Of course, Emeka replied proudly. A home without children can feel too quiet. Ngozi agreed. Yes, children bring joy. Emeka suddenly sat up straight and spoke with confidence. My first child must be a son. Ngozi looked at him for a moment. A son? She asked gently. Yes, Emeka replied firmly. A strong boy who will carry my family name. He will grow up and take over my business. Ngozi remained calm. A child is a blessing, she said quietly. Boy or girl? Emeka shook his head slightly. I know, but a son is important. Ngozi did not argue. She simply smiled and changed the subject. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Not long after their wedding celebration, family members began visiting the couple more often. In many African homes, relatives are always eager to hear good news about children. One afternoon, Emeka's mother visited their house. She entered the living room, looking around carefully before sitting down. Ngozi quickly brought her water. Welcome, Mama, she said respectfully. Emeka's mother drank the water slowly before speaking. My children, she began, your home is peaceful, and that makes me happy. Emeka smiled. Thank you, Mama. The older woman leaned forward. But I have a question. Ngozi looked slightly nervous. What question, Mama? Emeka asked. The old woman smiled knowingly. When will we hear the cry of a baby in this house? Ngozi lowered her eyes shyly. Emeka laughed loudly. Very soon, Mama. His mother nodded. I hope the first one will be a boy. Emeka quickly replied, Of course, a strong son. Ngozi remained silent. After his mother left, Ngozi sat quietly for some time. Emeka noticed. What are you thinking about? He asked. Ngozi looked at him gently. Do you really care that much about having a boy? Emeka did not hesitate. Yes. Ngozi sighed softly. Children are gifts from God, she said. Emeka shrugged. I know, but I still want a son first. Ngozi did not argue again. Life continued peacefully. Then one morning, something unexpected happened. Ngozi woke up feeling strange. Her body felt weak and she suddenly felt like vomiting. She hurried to the bathroom. After some time, she returned slowly to the bedroom. Emeka noticed her pale face. What is wrong? He asked with concern. I feel dizzy, Ngozi replied quietly. Emeka frowned. Maybe you are sick. Later that day, she visited a nearby clinic. After some tests, the nurse smiled brightly. Congratulations, the nurse said. Ngozi blinked in surprise. Congratulations for what? You are pregnant. For a moment, Ngozi could not speak. Then a wide smile spread across her face. Pregnant? She repeated. Yes, the nurse confirmed. Ngozi's heart filled with joy. She hurried home, eager to share the news. When Emeka returned from work that evening, Ngozi was waiting for him at the door. Her face glowed with excitement. Welcome, she said quickly. Emeka noticed her bright expression. You look very happy today, he said. Ngozi could not hold the news any longer. I went to the clinic today. Emeka looked confused. Why? Ngozi smiled widely. Because I felt strange this morning. Emeka stared at her. What did the doctor say? Ngozi took a deep breath. We are going to have a baby. For a moment, Emeka stood still. Then his face lit up with excitement. Are you serious? Ngozi nodded happily. Yes. Emeka jumped up in excitement. A baby, he shouted. He lifted Ngozi gently and spun her around. I am going to be a father. Ngozi laughed. Yes, you are. Emeka placed his hand on her stomach. My son is coming, he said proudly. Ngozi smiled but said nothing. From that day forward, Emeka became extremely excited. He told everyone the good news. At the market, he proudly announced it to his friends. My wife is pregnant, he said. His friends congratulated him warmly. That is wonderful news, one trader said. Emeka laughed confidently. My first child will be a strong boy. Back at home, Ngozi began preparing for motherhood. She visited the clinic regularly and followed the nurse's instructions carefully. Emeka also took good care of her. He no longer allowed her to carry heavy things. Sit down, he would say. You must rest. Sometimes he brought fruits home for her. This is good for the baby, he said. Months passed slowly. Ngozi's stomach began to grow bigger. Emeka watched her with excitement every day. At night, he would sit beside her and imagine the future. One day, I will teach my son how to run a business, he said proudly. Ngozi would smile softly. And if the baby is a girl, she asked playfully. Emeka shook his head immediately. No, this one is a boy. Ngozi laughed quietly. You sound very sure? I am very sure, Emeka insisted. Ngozi placed her hand on her stomach gently. Inside her heart, she whispered a silent prayer. God, give me a healthy child. She did not care whether the baby was a boy or a girl. For her, the most important thing was love. But unknown to them both, life had already written its own story, and that story would soon begin to unfold in ways neither of them could imagine. The months of waiting slowly came to an end. Ngozi's pregnancy had grown bigger with each passing day. Her stomach was now round and heavy, and walking had become slower for her. Still, she carried herself with patience and quiet happiness. Inside her heart, she was excited. Soon, she would hold her baby in her arms. Every morning, she woke up carefully, holding her back as she walked to the kitchen. Even simple work now required effort, but she did not complain. One evening, as the sun slowly disappeared behind the houses, Ngozi sat on a chair outside their home, rubbing her stomach gently. The baby inside moved slightly. She smiled. Are you greeting me? She whispered softly. At that moment, Emeka walked into the compound after returning from the market. Sweat covered his forehead, but his eyes immediately fell on Ngozi. My dear, he said, walking toward her quickly, you should not sit outside alone. Ngozi smiled calmly. I only came out for fresh air. Emeka bent down and placed his hand on her stomach. How is my son today? He asked with excitement. Ngozi laughed quietly. You always call the baby your son. Emeka nodded proudly. Because I know it will be a boy. And if it is not? Ngozi asked. Emeka shook his head confidently. It will be. Ngozi did not argue again. She only smiled and stood up slowly. Come inside. I made dinner before you came. Inside the house, the small dining table was neatly arranged. Ngozi served food carefully while Emeka washed his hands. As they ate, Emeka began talking about the future again. I have already started planning many things, he said proudly. Ngozi raised an eyebrow. Planning what? Emeka swallowed his food and continued. When my son grows older, I will take him to the market. I will teach him everything I know. Ngozi listened quietly. He will become a strong man, Emeka continued. He will continue the family name. Ngozi smiled softly. What if your child wants to become something different? Emeka waved his hand. We will talk about that when the time comes. Ngozi did not respond. Deep inside, she simply prayed that the baby would arrive safely. Weeks passed. The baby was almost due. Ngozi now stayed mostly indoors because moving around had become difficult. One night, as she lay on the bed resting, she suddenly felt a sharp pain in her stomach. She sat up slowly. Another pain came again, this time stronger. Emeka, she called softly. The baby is coming. Emeka stood up immediately. We must go to the hospital. He rushed outside and called for a taxi. Within a few minutes, they were on their way to the clinic. The journey felt longer than usual. Ngozi held onto the seat tightly as the contractions continued. Emeka sat beside her, worried but also excited. Everything will be fine, he kept saying. Soon, they arrived at the hospital. The nurses quickly placed Ngozi on a bed and wheeled her into the delivery room. One nurse turned to Emeka. "You must wait outside." Emeka nodded nervously. He sat on a wooden bench in the hospital corridor. Time seemed to move slowly. From inside the delivery room, he could hear faint sounds of Ngozi crying out in pain. Each cry made him shift uncomfortably on the bench. Several hours passed. Emeka stood up many times, pacing back and forth. Other families were also waiting in the hallway. Some prayed quietly. Others spoke softly among themselves. But Emeka remained silent. Inside his mind, he imagined the moment the nurse would come out carrying his baby boy. He imagined himself lifting the child proudly. "My son," he whispered to himself. Suddenly, a loud cry echoed from inside the room. A baby's cry. Emeka quickly stood up. Moments later, the delivery room door opened. A nurse stepped out with a bright smile on her face. She looked around until her eyes landed on Emeka. "Are you the husband of Ngozi?" she asked. Emeka walked forward quickly. "Yes, I am." The nurse's smile widened. "Congratulations!" Emeka held his breath. "It's a baby girl." For a brief moment, the hallway became silent. The smile on Emeka's face slowly faded. "A girl?" he repeated quietly. "Yes," the nurse said cheerfully. "A healthy baby girl." Emeka forced a small smile. "That is good." But inside his heart, disappointment quietly settled. The nurse continued speaking. "Both mother and child are doing well." Emeka nodded slowly. "Can I see them?" "Yes, come with me." He followed the nurse down the hallway into the room. Ngozi lay on the hospital bed, tired but glowing with happiness. In her arms was a tiny baby wrapped in a soft blanket. The child's small face looked peaceful. When Ngozi saw Emeka, her face lit up. "Look at her," she said softly. Emeka walked closer. The baby opened her eyes briefly and made a small sound. Ngozi smiled with deep love. "She's beautiful." Emeka looked at the child. She truly was beautiful. Her tiny fingers moved gently as she rested in her mother's arms. Ngozi carefully lifted the baby toward him. "Hold her," she said. Emeka hesitated slightly before taking the child. The baby felt very light in his arms. For a moment, he stared at her face. But instead of joy, his mind kept repeating the same words, "A girl." Ngozi noticed his change in expression. "Emeka," she said gently, "she is our child." Emeka nodded slowly. "Yes." Ngozi continued speaking. "She is healthy and beautiful. That is what matters." Emeka forced another smile. "You are right." Ngozi looked lovingly at the baby. "I have chosen a name." Emeka raised an eyebrow. "What name?" "Adaeze," she said proudly. Emeka repeated the name quietly. "Adaeze." Ngozi nodded. "Yes, it means the first daughter of the home." Emeka sighed softly but said nothing. Later that evening, relatives began arriving at the hospital. They congratulated the couple warmly. "Your baby is lovely," one woman said. Another person laughed happily. "A daughter brings joy to the home." Ngozi smiled gratefully at everyone, but Emeka remained quiet. He greeted the visitors politely, yet his excitement was not the same as before. 2 days later, Ngozi and the baby returned home. The house felt different now. Small baby clothes hung near the window. A tiny cradle stood beside the bed. Adaeze cried softly from time to time, filling the house with a new sound. Ngozi loved every moment. She carried the baby gently, sang to her, and watched her sleep peacefully. Emeka tried to behave normally. He bought diapers and baby supplies. He greeted the child occasionally, but inside his heart, something remained unsettled. One evening, Ngozi noticed his silence. They sat together in the living room while Adaize slept. "Emeka," Ngozi said softly. "Yes, you are quiet these days." Emeka looked away. "I am just tired from work." Ngozi studied his face carefully. "You are disappointed, aren't you?" Emeka hesitated. "No," he said quickly. Ngozi continued calmly. "You wanted a son." Emeka remained silent. Ngozi spoke gently. "She's still your child." Emeka finally looked at the sleeping baby. The child moved slightly in her cradle. "She looks peaceful," he said quietly. Ngozi smiled. "She will bring happiness to this house." Emeka nodded slowly. Yes. As days passed, little Adaize began filling the home with life. Her cries, her small movements, and her gentle sounds brought warmth into the house. Neighbors often visited to admire the baby. "Such a lovely child," they would say. Ngozi always smiled proudly. But deep inside Emeka's heart, one thought still remained. Maybe next time. Yet, neither of them knew that the future would hold many surprises, and the little girl sleeping quietly in the cradle would one day change everything. 2 years passed quietly after the birth of little Adaize. The small house that once felt silent was now full of life. Adaize had grown from a tiny newborn into a lively toddler who loved to run around the compound. Her tiny feet moved quickly across the yard, and her cheerful laughter often filled the air. Every morning she woke up early and ran to her mother. "Mama! Mama!" she would shout happily. Ngozi would bend down and lift her into a warm embrace. "Good morning, my sunshine," she would say with a smile. Adaize loved following her mother everywhere. Whether Ngozi was cooking, sweeping, or washing clothes, the little girl would stand nearby, watching carefully. Sometimes Adaize tried to help. One morning, Ngozi was washing plates in the kitchen when Adaize walked in carrying a spoon. "Mama, I help," the child said proudly. Ngozi laughed softly. "You want to help me?" Adaize nodded seriously. Ngozi gently took the spoon from her hand. "You are still very small," she said kindly, "but thank you for wanting to help." The child smiled widely. Even though Adaize brought joy into the house, something else had slowly begun to change. Emeka was not as cheerful as before. When Adaize was first born, he had tried to hide his disappointment, but as time passed, the feeling inside him continued to grow. He wanted a son. Whenever he visited the market, many of his friends spoke proudly about their sons. "My boy is already learning how to count money," one trader would say. Another man would laugh and add, "My son would take over my shop one day." Each time Emeka heard such conversations, his heart felt heavy. He would smile on the outside, but inside he felt something missing. One evening, after returning from work, Emeka sat quietly in the living room while Adaize played on the floor with a small toy. Ngozi noticed his silence. "You look tired," she said gently. Emeka nodded slowly. "Yes." Adaize ran toward him and hugged his leg. "Papa!" she shouted happily. Emeka looked down at her and forced a small smile. "Hello," he said quietly. Ngozi studied his face carefully. "You have something on your mind," she said. Emeka leaned back in his chair. "I have been thinking about our family." Ngozi sat beside him. "What about it?" Emeka sighed. "I still want a son." Ngozi did not argue further. Days later, something unexpected happened. Ngozi began feeling tired and dizzy again. At first, she thought it was just stress from taking care of Adaize, but when the strange feeling continued, she decided to visit the clinic. After some tests, the nurse smiled warmly. "Congratulations," the nurse said. Ngozi blinked in surprise. "You are pregnant again." For a moment, Ngozi sat quietly, absorbing the news. Then a small smile appeared on her face. "Thank you," she said softly. When she returned home later that day, Emeka was sitting outside reading a newspaper. She walked toward him slowly. "Emeka," she called. He looked up. "Yes, I have news." Emeka folded the newspaper. "What kind of news?" Ngozi took a deep breath. "I went to the clinic today." Emeka's face became serious. "Are you sick?" Ngozi shook her head gently. "No." Then she smiled. "I am pregnant." Emeka jumped up immediately. "Pregnant?" Ngozi nodded. "Yes." Emeka's face lit up with excitement. "This time it will be a boy," he said confidently. Ngozi laughed softly. "You have not even seen the baby yet." Emeka waved his hand. "I just know." He placed his hand on her shoulder. "This one must be my son." Ngozi smiled but said nothing. From that day forward, Emeka's excitement returned. He spoke constantly about the baby. At the market, he proudly told his friends, "My wife is expecting again," he said. His friends congratulated him. "This time you will have your son," one man said. Emeka nodded confidently. "I believe so." Meanwhile, at home, Ngozi carefully took care of herself. Adaeze often placed her small hand on her mother's stomach. "Mama, baby?" the little girl asked. Ngozi smiled. "Yes, a baby is coming." Adaeze clapped her hands happily. "Baby, play." Months passed slowly. Ngozi's stomach grew larger again. Adaeze often rested her head on her mother's lap while listening to the baby move inside. "Mama, baby moving," she would say in excitement. Ngozi laughed softly. "Yes, the baby is greeting you." But while Ngozi focused on the joy of motherhood, Emeka focused on something else. He constantly imagined holding a baby boy. He imagined teaching the child how to run a business. He imagined walking proudly through the market with his son beside him. Every night before sleeping, he repeated the same words. This one must be a boy. One evening, while they sat outside their house, Ngozi spoke carefully. "Emeka," she said. "Yes," he replied. "You should prepare your hearts for anything." Emeka frowned firmly. "What do you mean?" Ngozi looked calmly at the sky. "The baby could be a girl." Emeka shook his head firmly. "No." Ngozi sighed quietly. "Sometimes life surprises us." Emeka replied confidently. This time there will be no surprise. Weeks later, the pregnancy reached its final stage. Ngozi's body felt heavy and walking became difficult again. One night, while she was lying on the bed, a sudden sharp pain struck her stomach. She sat up quickly. Another pain followed. "Emeka," she called. Emeka rushed into the room. "What happened?" Ngozi held her stomach tightly. "The baby is coming." Emeka immediately stood up. "Let us go to the hospital." Within minutes, they were on their way to the clinic. Adaeze stayed with a neighbor while they left. At the hospital, nurses quickly placed Ngozi on a bed and wheeled her into the delivery room. Emeka was asked to wait outside again. He sat on the same wooden bench where he had waited 2 years earlier, but this time his mind was full of expectation. "This will be my son," he whispered. Hours passed. The sounds of labor echoed faintly from inside the room. Emeka stood up many times, pacing the hallway. Then suddenly, a baby's cry filled the air. Emeka froze. The delivery room door opened. A nurse walked out, smiling. "Are you the husband?" she asked. "Yes," Emeka replied quickly. The nurse clapped her hands gently. "Congratulations!" Emeka leaned forward eagerly. "It is a baby girl." The words hit him like a sudden storm. "A girl?" he repeated slowly. "Yes," the nurse said. "A healthy baby girl." Emeka felt his excitement disappear instantly. He forced a weak smile. "Thank you." Inside the room, Ngozi lay on the bed holding her newborn child. The baby was beautiful, with soft skin and tiny fingers. When Emeka entered the room, Ngozi looked at him with a tired but happy smile. "Look at her," she said softly. Emeka walked closer. The baby opened her eyes briefly. Ngozi held the child gently. "I have chosen her name," she said. Emeka looked at her quietly. "What name?" "Chiamaka." Emeka repeated the name slowly. "Chiamaka." Ngozi smiled. "Yes." Emeka nodded without enthusiasm. Though he tried to hide it, disappointment filled his heart. When they returned home days later, Adaeze was excited to see the baby. She jumped happily. "Baby, baby!" Ngozi laughed. "Yes, this is your little sister." Adaeze touched the baby's tiny hand carefully. "Hello, baby," she whispered. Ngozi watched the moment with deep joy, but Emeka's mood had begun to change. Days passed. He spent more time outside the house. Sometimes he returned home late at night. When neighbors asked about the baby, he simply nodded without excitement. One evening, he sat alone in the living room while the children slept. Ngozi approached him quietly. "You are unhappy," she said gently. Emeka sighed. "I cannot believe I only have daughters." Ngozi looked at him sadly. "They are still your children." Emeka rubbed his forehead. "I wanted a son." Ngozi remained calm. "Maybe one day." But Emeka's disappointment slowly turned into frustration. The peaceful home that once felt full of joy had begun to feel different, and neither of them knew that even greater challenges were waiting ahead. Life in the small house had changed greatly after the arrival of the second child. The home that once felt peaceful and cheerful now carried a quiet tension that everyone could feel, even the little children. Adaeze was now 4 years old. She had grown into a bright and lively girl who loved to talk and laugh. Her younger sister, Chiamaka, was 2 years old and still learning to walk properly. She often followed Adaeze everywhere, trying to copy everything her older sister did. Every morning, the two little girls filled the house with noise. They laughed, ran around the sitting room, and sometimes argued over toys. "Mama, she took my doll," Adaeze would complain. Chiamaka would quickly shake her head. "No, mine." Ngozi often laughed as she watched them. "You two must learn to share," she would say gently while separating them. Even though the children brought life into the house, the mood of their father had grown darker. Emeka no longer played with the girls the way other fathers did with their children. He rarely carried them, rarely spoke to them, and rarely smiled when they came close. Most evenings, he returned from the market looking tired and frustrated. Instead of sitting with his family, he often sat alone thinking quietly. Ngozi noticed the change, but she remained patient. One evening, after dinner, the children were sleeping peacefully in their small room. Ngozi sat beside Emeka in the living room. "Emeka," she said softly. He looked up from the newspaper in his hand. "Yes? You have been very quiet these days." Emeka sighed deeply. "You know why?" Ngozi remained calm. "Because of the children?" Emeka dropped the newspaper on the table. "I have 2 daughters already. 2. Ngozi spoke gently. "They are beautiful children." Emeka shook his head. "That is not the point." Ngozi waited for him to continue. "A man needs a son, someone to carry his name and continue his family line." Ngozi folded her hands quietly. "Children do not choose their gender." Emeka leaned forward. "I know that." He paused before speaking again. "But we can still try." Ngozi stared at him. "Try again?" "Yes," Emeka said strongly. "One more time." Ngozi felt nervous. "Emeka, we already have 2 children, but none of them is a boy," he replied quickly. Ngozi lowered her eyes. "Having another child is not easy." Emeka's voice grew firmer. "We will try one last time." Ngozi remained silent for a long moment. Inside her heart, she was worried. She feared what would happen if the next baby was not the son Emeka desperately wanted. But she also hoped that maybe, this time, peace would return to their home. Finally, she spoke quietly. "If that is what you truly want." Emeka nodded. "Yes." Ngozi took a deep breath. "All right." Emeka's face brightened slightly. "You will see. This time, it will be different." Weeks passed. Life continued normally, but something new was beginning again. One morning, Ngozi woke up feeling weak and dizzy. She sat on the edge of the bed, holding her head. Soon, the familiar feeling returned. Later that day, she visited the clinic. The nurse smiled after checking her. "You are pregnant again." Ngozi closed her eyes for a moment. "Thank you," she whispered quietly. When she returned home that evening, Emeka was sitting outside repairing a small radio. She walked slowly toward him. "Emeka," she called softly. "Yes?" "I went to the clinic today." Emeka's eyes widened. "What did they say?" Ngozi placed her hand gently on her stomach. "We are expecting another baby." Emeka stood up immediately. "Really?" Ngozi nodded. "Yes." Emeka's face filled with excitement. "This is the one," he said confidently. "My son is finally coming." Ngozi gave a small smile. "We will see." From that day forward, Emeka's hope returned stronger than ever. He spoke constantly about the coming child. At the market, he proudly shared the news with his friends. "My wife is pregnant again," he announced. One trader laughed. "You are chasing that son seriously." Emeka smiled. "This time, it will happen." Another man added jokingly, "If this one is also a girl, you must accept it." Emeka shook his head firmly. "No, this one is a boy." Meanwhile, at home, the pregnancy slowly progressed. Adaeze was curious about everything. "Mama, baby inside?" she asked one afternoon while touching Ngozi's stomach. Ngozi smiled. "Yes." Adaeze looked amazed. "How baby come inside?" Ngozi laughed softly. "You will understand when you grow up." Chiamaka simply clapped her hands and shouted happily whenever she heard the word baby. Months passed slowly. Ngozi's stomach grew larger again. Her movements became slower and she needed more rest. Sometimes she sat quietly watching her daughters play in the yard. Adaeze often helped her. "Mama, I bring water," the girl would say proudly. Ngozi smiled warmly. "You are a good helper." But as the months passed, Emeka's expectations grew stronger. Every night he repeated the same words. "This time must be my son." One evening, while they sat together, Ngozi spoke gently. "Emeka, yes, must you prepare your heart?" "For what?" "For whatever the baby turns out to be." Emeka frowned. "I already know." Ngozi sighed softly. "Life does not always follow our plans." Emeka crossed his arms. "You worry too much." Ngozi decided not to argue. Inside her heart, she prayed for peace. Finally, the day arrived. Late at night, Ngozi suddenly felt a sharp pain in her stomach. She sat up quickly on the bed. Another pain followed. "Emeka!" she called. Emeka rushed into the room. "What happened?" Ngozi held her stomach tightly. "The baby is coming." Emeka quickly grabbed his car keys. "We must go to the hospital." Their neighbor agreed to watch the children while they left. Soon they arrived at the clinic. The nurses quickly took Ngozi into the delivery room. Emeka remained outside again, walking back and forth in the corridor. His heart was full of expectation. "This will be my son," he whispered. Hours passed slowly. Finally, the sound of a newborn baby crying filled the air. Emeka froze. The house that once held laughter now felt heavy and quiet. Only a few months had passed since the birth of the third child, Somto, but everything had changed. The warm home that Ngozi had built with love no longer felt peaceful. The children were still small and innocent. Adaeze was 5 years old. Chiamaka was 3. Baby Somto was still learning how to crawl. They did not understand why their father's face was always hard and serious. Before Somto was born, Emeka had already begun to withdraw from his family, but after the third daughter arrived, his attitude grew even worse. He no longer hid his anger. Every morning when he woke up, he complained about something. Sometimes he complained about the crying baby. Sometimes he complained about the noise from the girls playing. Sometimes he complained about the house itself. Nothing pleased him anymore. One morning, Adaeze ran happily toward him as he prepared to leave for work. "Daddy, Daddy!" she shouted with excitement. She held a small drawing in her hand. "I draw something for you." The little girl stretched the paper toward him proudly. Emeka glanced at it for only a second. It was a simple drawing of a house with stick figures holding hands. "Daddy, Mommy, and us," Adaeze said proudly. Emeka's face did not change. He placed the paper on the table without smiling. "I am busy," he said coldly. The child's excitement disappeared. She stood still, confused. Ngozi watched the scene quietly from the kitchen. Her heart felt heavy, but she forced herself to remain calm. After Emeka left for the market, Adaeze slowly walked toward her mother. "Mama," she asked softly, "did Daddy not like my drawing?" Ngozi knelt down and hugged her daughter. "He likes it," she said gently. "Then why did he not smile?" Adaeze asked. Ngozi searched for the right words. "Your father is tired from work." Adaeze nodded slowly, though she did not fully understand. Later that afternoon, the girls played outside in the compound. Chiamaka tried to follow Adaeze, but she tripped and fell. She began to cry loudly. Ngozi quickly rushed to carry her. "It's all right," she said softly while dusting off her clothes. The baby Somto began crying from inside the house as well. Ngozi gently rocked the baby while comforting Chiamaka at the same time. Being a mother to 3 small children was not easy, but Ngozi did everything she could with patience. When evening arrived, Emeka returned from the market. He entered the house with a tired expression. The moment he stepped inside, he heard the baby crying. His face tightened. "This house is always noisy," he complained loudly. Ngozi walked toward him carefully while carrying Somto. "She is hungry," Ngozi explained calmly. Emeka shook his head with irritation. "Always crying, always shouting." Adaeze and Chiamaka stood quietly in the corner, watching their father. They were afraid to speak. During dinner, the atmosphere felt tense. The children ate quietly while Ngozi served the food. Emeka suddenly pushed his plate away. "I am tired of this life," he said angrily. Ngozi looked at him. "What do you mean?" Emeka leaned back in his chair. "You have given me nothing but daughters." The words fell heavily in the room. Adaeze looked confused. Chiamaka stopped eating. Ngozi tried to stay calm. "They are still your children," she said softly. Emeka shook his head. "I wanted sons." Ngozi took a deep breath. "You know that children are gifts." Emeka slammed his hand on the table. "This is not the life I imagined." The children became frightened. Somto began to cry again. Ngozi gently picked up the baby. "Please lower your voice," she said quietly, but Emeka was already angry. Ngozi quickly wiped her tears and hugged her daughters tightly. "It's all right," she said softly, but deep inside, her heart was broken. That night, the house felt emptier than ever. The man who once promised to build a happy family had walked away. From that moment forward, Ngozi understood that life had changed forever. She was now both mother and father to her 3 daughters. And though the road ahead would be difficult, she knew she had to stay strong for them. The morning after Emeka left, the house felt strangely quiet. Ngozi woke up slowly, her eyes heavy from crying through most of the night. For a moment, she lay still on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Everything felt different. The man who once shared the house with her was gone. But she did not have time to sit and think about her pain. A small voice called from the next room. "Mama!" It was Adaeze. Ngozi wiped her face quickly and stood up. When she entered the room, Adaeze was already awake. Chiamaka was still sleeping beside her, and baby Somto lay in the cradle making small sounds. "Mama," Adaeze said again, "where is Daddy?" Ngozi paused for a moment. The question pierced her heart. She forced a gentle smile. "Daddy has traveled for work," she replied quietly. Adaeze nodded slowly. "Oh." The child did not ask more questions. Ngozi picked up the baby and carried her to the sitting room. Somto began crying softly. "I know you are hungry," Ngozi whispered while rocking her. Soon, Chiamaka woke up too. The small house slowly filled with the usual sounds of children again. But something was missing. Later that morning, Ngozi sat alone in the kitchen after feeding the girls. Her mind was filled with worry. The little savings Emeka left behind would not last long. She had 3 young children to feed, 3 children to clothe, 3 children who would one day need education. She took a deep breath. "I must be strong," she whispered to herself. Later that day, she visited a neighbor named Mama Bisi. Mama Bisi was an older woman who lived 2 houses away. She was known for selling food by the roadside. When Ngozi arrived, Mama Bisi was already busy stirring a large pot of rice. "Good afternoon," Ngozi greeted politely. Mama Bisi turned and smiled warmly. "Ah, Ngozi, you are welcome." Ngozi hesitated before speaking. "Mama Bisi, I came to ask for advice." The older woman noticed the sadness in her eyes. "What happened?" Ngozi sat down slowly. "My husband has left." Mama Bisi frowned. "He left?" Ngozi nodded. "Yes." The woman shook her head slowly. "That man does not know the value of a good family." Ngozi remained silent. Mama Bisi placed her spoon down. "So, what will you do now?" Ngozi swallowed hard. "I must find a way to feed my children." Mama Bisi thought for a moment. "Can you cook well?" Ngozi nodded. "Yes." Mama Bisi smiled. "Then you can start selling food like me." Ngozi looked hopeful. "Do you think people will buy from me?" Mama Bisi laughed. "Of course. Good food always finds customers." That evening, Ngozi returned home with a new plan. The next morning, she woke up before sunrise. While the children were still sleeping, she began preparing food in the small kitchen. She cooked rice, beans, and stew. Soon, the delicious smell filled the house. Adaeze walked into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes. "Mama, what are you cooking?" Ngozi smiled. "Food to sell." Adaeze looked curious. "You will sell food?" "Yes." "Why?" Ngozi knelt beside her daughter. "So we can eat and live well." Adaeze nodded slowly. "I can help you." Ngozi kissed her forehead. "You are a good girl." Later that morning, Ngozi carried a small table outside the compound gate. She placed the pots of food carefully on top. At first, she felt shy. People passed by, glancing at the food. For several minutes, no one stopped. Ngozi began to worry. But then, a man walking down the street paused. "How much is the rice?" he asked. Ngozi smiled politely. "Very affordable." The man bought a plate of food. Soon, another person came. Then another. Before long, the pots began to empty. By the afternoon, most of the food was sold. Ngozi counted the money in her hands. It was not much, but it was something. That night, she bought a small bag of rice and vegetables from the market. At dinner time, she placed food on the table. Adaeze smiled happily. "Mama, you did well today." Ngozi laughed softly. "Yes, we did." Days turned into weeks. Ngozi continued selling food every morning. Adaeze often helped by arranging the plates. Chiamaka sometimes carried small spoons to customers. Even little Somto watched from a chair nearby. Life was not easy. Some days the food did not sell well. Some days rain forced her to close early. But Ngozi refused to give up. When she finished selling food each day, she also worked on small sewing jobs. A neighbor sometimes brought clothes that needed repair. Ngozi would sit by the window at night, carefully stitching fabric under a small lamp. Her hands often felt tired, but she kept working. One night, Adaze walked into the room while Ngozi was sewing. "Mama, why are you still working?" Ngozi smiled. "I must finish this before morning." Adaze sat beside her. "You work very hard." Ngozi touched her daughter's cheek gently. "I work because I love you." Adaze hugged her tightly. Meanwhile, the children continued growing. They learned important lessons from watching their mother. They saw her wake up early every morning. They saw her work late every night. They saw her refuse to complain. One evening, while they sat together eating dinner, Ngozi spoke seriously. "My daughters," she said gently. The girls looked at her. "Yes, Mama." "You must always remember something." "What is it?" Adaze asked. Ngozi looked at them carefully. "You are not less because you are girls." The girls listened quietly. Ngozi continued speaking. "You are strong. You are capable. You can become anything in life." Adaze nodded. "I want to become a very important person one day." Chiamaka raised her hand proudly. "I want to become very smart." Some too clapped happily, even though she did not fully understand. Ngozi laughed softly. "You will all become great." Years slowly passed. The little girls grew taller. Adaze began attending primary school. She was very intelligent and always eager to learn. Her teachers quickly noticed her brilliance. One afternoon, her teacher called Ngozi after school. "Your daughter is very special," the teacher said. Ngozi smiled proudly. "She studies hard." The teacher nodded. "She is always asking questions." At home, Adaze often helped her younger sisters with simple lessons. She would draw letters on a small chalkboard. "This is A," she explained patiently. Chiamaka repeated happily, "A." Even little Somto tried to copy them. Life remained challenging. Some nights the food in the house was not enough. Ngozi sometimes ate less so the children could eat more. One evening, Adaze noticed something. "Mama, why are you not eating?" Ngozi smiled. "I already ate earlier," but Adaze understood. She quietly placed some of her food into her mother's plate. "We can share." Ngozi felt tears in her eyes. She hugged her daughter tightly. "You are a wonderful child." Through these struggles, the bond between mother and daughters grew stronger. They laughed together. They supported one another. They dreamed together. And slowly, the seeds of determination began growing inside the hearts of the three girls. Though life had been unfair to them, they refused to be defeated. Their mother had taught them something powerful. Hard work, love, and courage could overcome even the most painful challenges. And those lessons would one day change their lives forever. Years passed quietly, yet every season brought new changes to the small house where Ngozi lived with her three daughters. The girls were no longer little children running around the compound without care. Time had slowly carried them into their teenage years. Adaze, the first child, had grown into a tall and calm young girl. Her eyes were always full of curiosity, and she loved understanding how things worked. Chiamaka, the second child, was cheerful and energetic. She enjoyed solving numbers and puzzles and often finished her homework faster than most students in her class. Somto, the youngest, had become creative and imaginative. She liked drawing pictures, creating new ideas, and thinking about how to make things better. Although the family still lived in the same modest house, their lives had slowly begun to improve. Ngozi's food business had grown a little stronger. Many people in the neighborhood now knew her cooking was delicious. Every morning, customers stopped by her small stand to buy rice, beans, and stew. Even though the income was not large, it was enough to keep the family going. The girls understood how hard their mother worked. Because of that, they became very serious about their education. One afternoon, after school had ended, Adaeze walked home quickly with her school bag hanging over her shoulder. She entered the compound and saw her mother sitting outside sorting vegetables. "Mama?" Adaeze greeted. Ngozi looked up with a warm smile. "Welcome back, my daughter. How was school today?" Adaeze dropped her bag on the chair. "It was good." Chiamaka and Somto soon arrived behind her, the house filled with the cheerful noise of young voices. After eating lunch together, the girls sat in the living room to do their homework. Adaeze opened an old radio that had stopped working. Inside the radio were many small wires and tiny metal pieces. Chiamaka stared at her curiously. "What are you doing?" Adaeze replied calmly. "The radio stopped working. I want to see what is wrong with it." Chiamaka laughed. "You think you can fix it?" Adaeze nodded. "Yes." Somto leaned closer. "Is it difficult?" Adaeze shook her head. "Everything has a system. You just need to understand it." For nearly an hour, Adaeze carefully examined the radio. She adjusted a few wires and cleaned some parts. Then she closed the back panel and pressed the power button. Suddenly, music filled the room. The girls screamed with excitement. "It works!" Somto shouted. Chiamaka looked amazed. "How did you do that?" Adaeze smiled proudly. "I just followed the problem step by step." From that day forward, people in the neighborhood began bringing broken radios, small fans, and other devices to Adaeze. She enjoyed fixing them. Sometimes she sat under the mango tree outside the house, with tools spread across a small table. Her mother often watched her with quiet pride. One evening, Ngozi said gently, "You have a special gift." Adaeze smiled. "I just like solving problems." Meanwhile, Chiamaka was developing her own special talent. She loved numbers more than anything. Mathematics felt easy to her, like a simple game. During class, when the teacher wrote difficult problems on the board, many students struggled. But Chiamaka raised her hand confidently. "May I try?" she asked. The teacher nodded. She walked to the board and solved the problem quickly. The classroom burst into applause. One afternoon, the mathematics teacher spoke privately with Ngozi. "Your daughter has an amazing mind," the teacher said. Ngozi smiled proudly. "She studies very hard." The teacher nodded. "She could become a great scientist one day." Ngozi felt her heart fill with joy. Meanwhile, the youngest sister, Somto, had a completely different talent. She loved imagining new ideas. Her notebooks were filled with drawings of machines, buildings, and inventions. One day, during a science project, Somto presented a design for a simple solar-powered phone charger. Her teacher looked at the drawing carefully. "Did you design this yourself?" the teacher asked. Somto nodded. "Yes." The teacher smiled widely. "You have a creative mind." Somto beamed with pride. Back at home, the three sisters often studied together. The small living room became their study space. Books covered the table. Pens and notebooks were scattered everywhere. Sometimes they stayed awake late into the night discussing ideas. One evening, Adaeze spoke thoughtfully. "I want to build machines that solve real problems." Chiamaka nodded. "And I want to create programs that can calculate things very quickly." Somto smiled. "I want to design technology that makes life easier." Adaeze looked at her sisters. "What if we work together one day?" Chiamaka laughed. That would be amazing. Somto clapped her hands. Yes! Their dreams began growing stronger each day. At school, teachers were amazed by the three sisters. One afternoon, during a staff meeting, several teachers discussed them. These girls are very special, one teacher said. Another nodded. They are among the best students we have. The school principal later invited Ngozi for a meeting. When Ngozi arrived at the office, she felt nervous. The principal greeted her warmly. Please, sit down. Ngozi sat carefully. Is there a problem? She asked quietly. The principal smiled. Not at all. He opened a file on his desk. Your daughters are extraordinary students. Ngozi felt relief. They try their best. The principal nodded. They have excellent grades in science, mathematics, and technology subjects. Ngozi's eyes filled with pride. The principal continued speaking. We believe they have the potential to study advanced technology in university. Ngozi looked surprised. University? Yes, the principal said, but we understand your financial situation. Ngozi lowered her head slightly. I try my best to support them. The principal leaned forward. There are scholarship programs for talented students. Ngozi's eyes widened. Scholarships? Yes. The principal smiled. If they pass the national scholarship exam, their education can be fully funded. Ngozi almost could not believe what she was hearing. That evening, she shared the news with her daughters. There is an opportunity for you, she said. Adaeze listened carefully. What kind of opportunity? Ngozi explained everything. The girls stared at each other with excitement. We will study hard, Adaeze said. We will pass the exam, Chiamaka added. Somto smiled brightly. We must make Mama proud. From that day forward, the sisters worked harder than ever before. They woke up early each morning to study before school. They spent afternoons solving practice questions. They stayed awake late at night reviewing lessons. Some nights, Ngozi watched them quietly from the doorway. Her heart filled with emotion. One evening, she walked into the room. You have studied enough for today, she said gently. Adaeze shook her head. We want to be prepared. Ngozi smiled. I am proud of you. Months passed. Finally, the day of the scholarship examination arrived. The sisters dressed carefully in their school uniforms. Ngozi prayed over them before they left. Go and do your best, she said. We will, they replied together. The exam lasted several hours. The questions were difficult, but the sisters remained calm. When the results were finally announced weeks later, the school erupted with excitement. Adaeze, Chiamaka, and Somto had all passed with excellent scores. They had won full scholarships to study technology and computer science at a prestigious university. The principal called Ngozi again. This is a rare achievement, he said proudly. Ngozi could hardly speak. Tears rolled down her cheeks. My daughters did it. That evening, the house was filled with celebration. Neighbors came to congratulate them. You raised remarkable children, one woman said. Ngozi smiled humbly. They worked very hard. As the night grew quiet, the sisters sat together outside under the mango tree. Adaeze looked at the sky thoughtfully. Our journey is just beginning. Chiamaka nodded. We will achieve great things. Somto smiled brightly, and we will always remember where we came from. Inside the house, Ngozi listened to their voices. Her heart felt full of gratitude. The struggles she had faced, the sleepless nights, the endless work, all of it had been worth it. Her daughters were no longer just children. They were brilliant minds ready to change the world. The years at the university passed faster than the sisters expected. When Adaeze, Chiamaka, and Somto first arrived on campus, everything felt new and exciting. The tall buildings, large classrooms, busy libraries, and advanced computer laboratories amazed them. For the first time in their lives, they had access to powerful machines, high-speed internet, and teachers who were experts in technology. The three sisters did not waste the opportunity. From the first day, they focused on learning everything they could. Adaeze spent long hours studying computer hardware and software engineering. She loved understanding how machines worked from the inside. Chiamaka concentrated on mathematics and programming logic. She enjoyed writing codes that could solve complicated problems. Somto explored design, user experience, and creative digital systems. She believed technology should not only work well, but also look simple and beautiful. Although their courses were demanding, the sisters supported each other. Every evening after lectures, they met in the campus library. Books, laptops, and notebooks covered their table. Students passing by often noticed the three young women deeply focused on their work. One evening, while they were studying together, Somto closed her laptop and sighed. "We have learned so much," she said. Chiamaka looked up. "Yes, but learning never ends." Adaeze smiled. "I believe we can create something useful one day." Somto leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Adaeze replied calmly. "Technology can solve many problems in society." Chiamaka nodded thoughtfully. "That is true." Somto's eyes lit up. "What if we start our own company after graduation?" For a moment, the table became quiet. Then Adaeze smiled slowly. "That would be a big dream." Chiamaka laughed out loud. Big dreams are the ones worth chasing. The three sisters looked at each other with excitement. Their idea had been planted. Years later, graduation day finally arrived. The university hall was filled with families, friends, and proud parents. Ngozi sat quietly in the audience, wearing her best dress. Her eyes shone with pride as she watched her daughters walk across the stage one by one. Adaeze received her degree in software engineering. Chiamaka received hers in computer science and applied mathematics. Somto graduated with a degree in digital systems design. As each sister received her certificate, applause filled the hall. Ngozi wiped tears from her eyes. "My daughters," she whispered softly. After the ceremony, the sisters hugged their mother tightly. "You did it," Ngozi said with joy. Adaeze smiled. "We all did it, Mama." Chiamaka added, "Your sacrifices made this possible." Somto nodded. "We will never forget." After graduation, many students began searching for jobs in large companies, but the sisters had already made a decision. One evening, they sat together in their small apartment. Adaeze spoke first. "Do we still agree about our dream?" Chiamaka nodded immediately. "Yes." Somto smiled. "I have been thinking about it every day." Adaeze leaned forward. "Then let us start our own company." The room fell silent for a moment. Chiamaka finally spoke. "We may not have much money." Somto added, "And many people may not believe in us." Adaeze looked at both of them confidently. "But we have knowledge." Chiamaka smiled. "And determination." Somto raised her hand playfully. "And creativity." They all laughed. Their journey had begun. The sisters returned home to their mother and explained their plan. Ngozi listened carefully. "You want to start a business?" she asked. "Yes," Adaeze replied. Ngozi thought for a moment. "I do not know much about technology," she said slowly, "but I know you are hard-working." She held their hands. "If you believe in this dream, then I believe in you." Those words gave the sisters strength. Using the little money they had saved, they rented a tiny office in a quiet part of the city. The room was very small. It had only one table, 3 chairs, and space for a few computers. When they first entered the office, Somto looked around and laughed. "This place is tiny." Chiamaka smiled. Every big company once started small. Adaeze placed her laptop on the table. "This is where our future begins." They named their company Bright Code Solutions. The first few months were extremely difficult. Many days passed without any customers. The sisters spent most of their time designing software ideas. Sometimes they created applications that no one used. Sometimes their programs failed completely.